They're not afraid of love. They're afraid of what love exposes. Because love doesn't just connect, it reveals. And for someone built around avoidance, revelation feels like threat. This is where most explanations get it wrong. They say avoidance is about independence, or fear of commitment, or not wanting closeness. That's surface level. Avoidance isn't about distance. It's about control over exposure. Because exposure activates something much older than the relationship itself. It activates the moment they learned it wasn't safe to be fully seen, not emotionally, not psychologically, not as they were. So the system adapted. It learned how to stay connected without being exposed, how to remain present without being vulnerable, how to engage without surrendering control. Avoidance is not a lack of feeling. It's a containment strategy, a way of keeping inner experience from becoming visible, because visibility once had a cost, and the body remembers costs long after the mind forgets them. This is the hidden fear, not abandonment, not engulfment, but exposure without protection, being seen without knowing how to regulate. What comes next? When love approaches someone like this, it doesn't feel warm. It feels invasive, not because the other person is doing anything wrong, but because intimacy bypasses defenses. It softens structure. It invites honesty. It asks for presence instead of performance. And presence is dangerous to a system that survived by hiding. This is why love creates distance, not because closeness is unwanted, but because closeness removes control over how much of the self is revealed. Avoidance systems are organized around predictability, around managing impressions, around keeping inner chaos contained. Love disrupts that. Love says, you don't have to manage this. And that sentence alone can trigger fear, because management was the survival skill. Without it, there's no guarantee of safety. So the system tightens. It intellectualizes. It detaches. It pulls back emotionally to regain equilibrium. From the outside, this looks like disinterest, coldness, withdrawal. But internally, it's regulation. A nervous system trying to regain control after feeling exposed. This is why reassurance doesn't help, why patience doesn't fix it, why love doesn't heal it. Because the threat isn't relational. It's internal. It's the fear of what happens if defenses drop, what feelings might surface, what needs might emerge, what vulnerability might demand that they don't know how to offer. Avoidance protects against collapse, collapse of identity, collapse of control, collapse of the version of self that learned how to survive by staying unreadable. This is also why avoidant behavior often escalates when the connection is actually good, when the other person is consistent, emotionally available, secure, because secure presence doesn't mirror avoidance. It doesn't chase. It doesn't withdraw. It stays. And staying is the most threatening thing to a system that relies on distance. To feel safe, there's nowhere to hide when someone doesn't leave. So the system creates space, not because it wants to, but because it needs to breathe. This fear isn't conscious. They don't think, I'm scared of being seen. They think, I just need space. I feel overwhelmed. Something feels off. Those are regulation signals, not relational truths. And this is the core misunderstanding that keeps people stuck. They think they're reacting to the relationship. They're actually reacting to themselves, to what intimacy activates internally, to the emotions they learned were too much, too dangerous, too unsupported. So distance becomes safety, control becomes calm, and avoidance becomes identity. Until it isn't. Until awareness begins. And awareness is destabilizing. Because once this fear is named, it can't be unseen. And systems don't like being seen. That's the paradox. The very thing they avoid is what would heal them. But healing requires surrender. And surrender feels like risk to a system that survived by holding on. This is the hidden fear beneath avoidance. Not love, not closeness, but exposure without protection. Being known without knowing how to stay intact. This fear doesn't appear overnight. It's constructed, slowly, quietly, usually long before adult relationships ever begin. It forms in environments where emotions were inconvenient, where needs were minimized, where closeness came with conditions, not necessarily abuse, often something more subtle. Inconsistency, emotional unpredictability, care that depended on performance, love that required self-monitoring. In those environments, the nervous system learns a rule. Visibility is risky because being fully seen doesn't guarantee safety. So the system adapts. It learns how to stay connected without being exposed, how to be present without revealing need, how to engage without depending. Avoidance is not absence. It's strategy, a highly intelligent one. The child learns, if I don't need too much, I won't overwhelm anyone. If I stay self-contained, I won't be disappointed. If I keep parts of myself private, I can't be hurt there. Over time, this becomes identity, not something they do, something they are. They grow into adults who are functional, capable, often successful. They handle life well. But emotional intimacy doesn't feel like support. It feels like pressure, because pressure comes when something wants access to parts of the self that were never safely held. This is why avoidance persists, even when circumstances change, even when partners are kind, even when love is consistent. The body doesn't respond to logic. It responds to memory, and memory lives in sensation, in tightening, in pulling back, in the urge to regulate alone. This is why avoidant fear often shows up somatically: a heaviness in the chest, restlessness, irritation, a vague sense of too much. These sensations are misread. They're labeled as incompatibility, as boredom, as loss of attraction, but they're actually activation. The nervous system saying, this is unfamiliar territory. This level of closeness was never rehearsed. This requires skills I don't have. And instead of learning new skills, the system defaults to old ones: distance, control, detachment. Because those worked before, they kept things manageable. They kept identity intact. This is where misunderstanding deepens. Because the avoidant person often believes they are being honest. They genuinely feel overwhelmed. They genuinely feel the need for space. They're not lying, but they're also not seeing the full picture. They're responding to internal threat, not relational danger. And because the threat is internal, no external reassurance resolves it. More love doesn't help. More patience doesn't help. More explanation doesn't help. Sometimes it makes it worse, because attention increases exposure, and exposure is the trigger. This is why secure presence can feel more destabilizing than chaotic dynamics. Chaos allows distance. Inconsistency creates breathing room, but steadiness holds space. And holding space is exactly what reveals unprocessed fear. This is also why avoidance systems often feel safer in control roles: leading, directing, defining terms, because control limits unpredictability. It keeps emotional territory contained. But love doesn't ask for control. It asks for mutual influence, for permeability, for allowing another person to matter. And mattering is dangerous when you don't know how to regulate the feelings that come with it. This is the origin of the fear. Not rejection, not abandonment, but the loss of self-coherence. The fear that closeness will destabilize identity, that need will overwhelm capacity, that vulnerability will expose something unmanageable. So avoidance protects structure, even at the cost of intimacy, even at the cost of depth, even at the cost of connection, because safety comes first. Always. This is why avoidant behavior often feels self-sabotaging from the outside, but from the inside, it's survival logic, flawed for adult intimacy, but effective for emotional containment. Understanding this reframes everything. It explains why avoidant individuals can want connection and still retreat from it, why they can care deeply and still withdraw, why they can feel love and still feel trapped by it. It's not contradiction, it's conflict between desire and capacity is shaped early, long before choice enters the picture. This is also why avoidance is so resistant to change, because it's not a habit, it's an identity strategy. It answers the question, how do I stay safe while staying connected? And until a new answer is learned, the old one remains, even when it hurts, even when it costs relationships, even when it creates loneliness, because loneliness feels familiar. Exposure does not. This is the part that rarely gets named. Avoidance systems often prefer a predictable emptiness over an unpredictable closeness, because emptiness doesn't overwhelm. Closeness does. This doesn't make them broken. It makes them adapted. But adaptation has limits, and those limits show up when intimacy deepens, when stakes increase, when someone stays. That's when the fear surfaces, not as panic, as withdrawal. And without understanding this, people personalize it. They think they did something wrong. They think they asked for too much. They think love wasn't enough. But love was never the problem. Capacity was. And capacity can't be forced. It has to be built. Slowly, safely, with awareness. And without awareness, avoidance remains invisible, even to the person living inside it. This fear doesn't just live inside them. It organizes the relationship, quietly, consistently. It shapes pacing, depth, availability, without ever being named. At first, it looks manageable, even attractive. They seem independent, grounded, unbothered. They don't cling. They don't chase. They don't overwhelm. And early on, this can feel stabilizing, especially to someone who knows emotional chaos. The absence of intensity feels like maturity. The distance feels like balance. But what's actually happening is that intimacy is being regulated, not consciously, somatically. Closeness is allowed, up to a threshold. Then the system pulls back. Conversation becomes lighter. Contact becomes less frequent. Vulnerability becomes selective, not absent, filtered. This creates a push-pull dynamic that is hard to detect at first because nothing is overt. There's no conflict, no drama, just a subtle contraction. After moments of closeness, a step back. After emotional connection, a cooling. After warmth. This is how the fear protects itself, not by rejecting the bond, by thinning it. The partner often feels this. Before they can explain it, something shifts. Energy changes. They feel less met, less mirrored, less held. But when they check in, nothing obvious is wrong. And this is where confusion begins. Because the avoidant partner often doesn't understand it either. They just feel off, crowded, needing space. They interpret this as something external, stress, timing, the relationship moving too fast. They don't see the pattern. They only feel the sensation. So the relationship adapts. Without discussion, the other person learns to soften, to slow down, to self-edit. They stop sharing as much. They stop asking for depth. They stop naming needs, not because they don't have them, but because they sense where the edge is. They start managing the connection for both people. And this is where the real cost appears. Because the relationship becomes asymmetrical. One nervous system expands. The other contracts. One person holds space. The other regulates distance. And over time, this creates imbalance. The avoidant partner remains regulated by keeping control. The other partner becomes dysregulated by constantly adjusting. They may not even notice it at first. They tell themselves it's normal, that every relationship has differences. But slowly, they feel less like themselves. They shrink to maintain closeness. They withhold to preserve peace. They become quieter, less expressive, more careful. And this is often mistaken for compatibility. It works because we don't fight. But the absence of conflict isn't the presence of intimacy. It's the absence of friction. And friction is where truth lives. Without it, The bond loses elasticity. It can't stretch. It can't deepen. It can only maintain. This is why avoidant-driven relationships often plateau. They don't collapse immediately. They stall. They stay functional, but unfulfilled, connected, but not intimate, stable, but not alive. And eventually, this stagnation creates pressure, not explosive pressure, quiet pressure, a sense of loneliness, inside togetherness. The non-avoidant partner feels unseen. The avoidant partner feels misunderstood. Both feel dissatisfied, but neither knows why. This is when narratives form. The avoidant may think, I'm just not that emotional. This person needs more than I can give. I feel trapped. The other partner may think, I'm too much. I should be more independent. If I ask for more, I'll lose them. These narratives harden. They shape behavior. And instead of addressing the real issue, both people adapt around it. The relationship survives, but it doesn't grow. This is the consequence of the hidden fear. Not dramatic endings, but prolonged disconnection. It explains why avoidant relationships often end quietly, with distance, with ambiguity, with unresolved feelings. Because there was never a clear rupture, just a gradual thinning of bond, until there was nothing left to hold. And when the relationship finally ends, both people feel confused. The non-avoidant partner wonders why love wasn't enough. The avoidant partner wonders why it felt so heavy. Neither sees the fear that shaped everything. This fear doesn't announce itself. It disguises itself as preference, as personality, as boundaries. And boundaries are important. But when boundaries are used to avoid emotional exposure, they become walls, not protection, containment. And containment suffocates connection. This is why the fear is so powerful. It doesn't destroy relationships from the outside. It erodes them from the inside, slowly, silently, until intimacy feels impossible, even when affection remains. This is also why many avoidant individuals look back on relationships with confusion. They didn't feel abused. They didn't feel unloved. They just felt constrained. And they don't understand that the constraint came from inside, from a nervous system that never learned how to hold closeness without losing itself. Until that is addressed, the pattern repeats. Different partner, same distance, same plateau, same ending. Not because love fails, but because the system never learned how to stay present. When connection deepens, understanding this fear changes how you see everything, not just them, but yourself. Because once you see what was actually happening, self-blame loses its grip. You stop asking why you weren't enough. You stop replaying conversations. You stop searching for the moment. You ruined things. There was no moment. There was a limit, a nervous system limit, and you didn't cross it. You reached it. That's an important distinction. You weren't asking for too much. You were asking for something their system didn't know how to hold. And that doesn't make them bad, but it also doesn't make you wrong. This clarity creates something subtle. Relief. Not the loud kind, the grounded kind, the kind that allows your body to finally stand down. Because when you stop personalizing someone else's fear, your nervous system recalibrates. You stop scanning for danger. You stop adjusting your tone. You stop shrinking your needs to maintain connection, not out of defiance, out of alignment. You begin to feel more solid, more present, more like yourself. And this is where real change happens. Not through confrontation, not through explanation, but through embodiment. Because once you understand that intimacy triggered fear, you stop chasing reassurance. You stop trying to prove safety. You stop negotiating closeness. You simply become consistent with who you are. And that consistency does something powerful. It creates clarity, clarity for you, and clarity for anyone who connects with you. People who can meet you, feel drawn in, not because you're performing, but because you're available. People who can't meet you, feel unsettled, not because you've changed, but because you're no longer adapting. And this is where identity calm emerges. You no longer define yourself by how much someone can give. You define yourself by how much you can hold without abandoning yourself. You recognize early when depth is being regulated. You feel the contraction, the thinning, and instead of chasing it, you pause. You observe. You stay with yourself. This doesn't mean you close your heart. It means you open it without losing discernment. You allow connection without self-erasure. You let intimacy unfold at a pace that feels mutual. And if someone pulls back, when closeness deepens, you don't take it as rejection. You take it as information. Information about capacity, not worth. This shift is quiet, but it's permanent. Because once you've seen the pattern, you can't unsee it. You recognize the difference between emotional unavailability and emotional pacing, between boundaries and avoidance, between independence and disconnection. And you stop romanticizing distance. You stop confusing restraint with depth. You stop calling absence mystery. You don't need intensity to feel alive. And you don't accept stagnation as love. This is not empowerment through force. It's empowerment through clarity. You don't need to fix anyone. You don't need to wait. You don't need to convince. You simply align with what feels reciprocal. And the people who can meet you step forward. The people who can't step away without drama, without collapse, without needing to be right. This is what happens when understanding replaces confusion, when perspective replaces longing, when self-trust replaces self-doubt. You don't harden, you soften, but you don't fold. And from this place, relationships change, not because you demand more, but because you no longer participate in dynamics that require less of you. If this felt familiar, it's because you've lived it. And if this brought relief, it's because your system recognizes truth. You're not broken. You were simply ready for a depth someone else hadn't reached yet. And that awareness isn't loss. It's orientation. If this gave language to something you've felt for a long time, drop a comment, not for validation, but as a quiet acknowledgement that you're standing in a clearer place now.